Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Libertarianism, the next in my Cultural History of the United States series. First, let me say, class, still a few spots available, so if you're interested, please sign up. I'll close enrollment in a couple of weeks, so if you're interested, please send me a message or just sign up online. Thank you to everybody who has signed up. It's getting close. I've got to get my act together and get the new space ready. So, all right. Libertarianism in the United States. Pretty much, if you didn't believe anything that I've said so far in this series, always good to be skeptical, by the way, I think libertarianism would sort of, it's almost like they invented libertarianism just to make my argument look good. Of course, it works the other way around, where it was in trying to understand how people took libertarianism seriously that I was able to unpack some of the issues surrounding the foundation of American cultural history. And one safety note is I actually find it hard to take libertarianism seriously, particularly as it's generally popularly deployed as a philosophy, because it raises some interesting points, but it just really doesn't, as far as I can tell, with a few prominent exceptions, very little of the work to answer the kinds of questions it raised. But we'll go through that. So I'm just very skeptical of libertarianism as a concept, just because it's not well fleshed out, and particularly not when it's in its popular deployment. So we'll talk about that. So what is libertarianism? Where does it come from? And how does it relate to everything we've been talking to? So, the general components here is an emphasis on individuality. So it is, which again, why I talked about individualism early, it is a sort of unbelievable extension and manifestation of the American belief in the individual, kind of taken to its, logical extreme. Big belief in individual rights. Not only individual is the most important, but individual rights therefore become super important. Spontaneous order, which is kind of this idea that comes up in a couple of different places. But the idea is that if people are just left to sort themselves out, they will sort of through the free market, usually is the model that's used, and they will sort of spontaneously create the best possible society. And that when you try to put like a government over the top of people, that messes things up. Oddly, given what I just said, they believe a very strong belief in the rule of law, most specifically the protection of property rights, which we'll see this is the key one. And because they believe in individuality, they want to limit government, because they see this as essentially a trade-off. The more government you have, the less individual freedom you have. Individual freedom is the best possible good. Again, that's not just a good, it's the best possible good. And so maximizing individual freedom means minimizing governments. And all of this is best organized through free markets, again, free association, free capacity to create exchange and to do whatever you want, basically. And it uses a model of the individual, as we'll see, as sort of a homo economos, the idea that we're basically all just pieces of property engaging with other pieces of property in different kinds of exchanges. Like, this is how you understand the human being and the human condition. I'm trying to think if there are any other ones that are significant for us. And then of course the real strong virtue, a value that they place on productivity, like being a valuable member of society, means being the best, most successful individual you can possibly be. Again, this demonstrates your value to society, and you're doing it right, because that means you've used your personal liberty in the correct way. And so the idea is, if you use your personal liberty in the correct way, this is not just the best for you, it's the best for everybody else. So by being maximally successful and maximally free, you help everybody else. So when you're, so it looks selfish because it's all focused on you as a person. However, the logic of it is, by extension, when you're doing your best, when you're rich, when you're powerful, when you're successful, that is a proof that society is working and makes it better for everybody else. somehow. I mean, that's the concept. And unsurprisingly, of course, you can see why this is very closely related to Calvinism, individualism, and materialism. Right? It's not that confusing. We'll go over that in more detail, but that you can see the elements already. So where does this come from? And the big character that everybody cites is Hayek, and I want to do a sort of defense of Hayek because I think he is a serious thinker. There's no but I think the way he's deployed is unserious, so it makes Hayek sort of retroactively look worse than he was. So, and he is an interesting thinker because of the generation that he was in. He was born 1899, 1900, Austrian. So if you know anything about world history, of course, anybody who was born then is going to be in for a rough ride. I mean, this is, here we go, World War I, World War II coming, Soviet threat. This is his life. This is his life arc. And so what he experienced was the transformation basically from old systems of government, monarchical rights, absolutism, the aristocracy, into a new technocratic industrialization. And he saw 2 world wars, but most specifically World War I. And he saw these attempts at liberal governments and parliamentary exchanges just get annihilated. And then in the interwar period, he saw the buildup of Nazi Germany and the USSR. And he's like, oh my gosh, like the Soviet Union is a planned economy, and that doesn't look very attractive. And then you have the fascists. They're a planned economy. That doesn't look very attractive. You have all the basic social democratic, which were very socialist, relatively speaking, around Europe, experimenting, the Weimar Republic, other attempts at sort of UK. And he looked at all these models and he said, wow, not surprisingly, by the way, this doesn't seem to be working as well as one might hope, right? And he thought there's got to be a way to work this out. And he would sort of be what might be called a classical liberal. Sorry about that. We had a warning siren go off in the background. Okay, we're back. So Hayek is a classical liberal, if you will, in which he's asking the question, and this is the value, I think, of libertarianism to the extent that it has value, because it asks a very good question. It's been asked for a long time in the Enlightenment and before, which is how do you have a society that is maximally free, that gives individuals the maximum capacity to express themselves and to most fully realize their personal and individual's abilities. How do you construct such a society? So this is a very interesting and powerful question. I think one that bears, sort of an infinite amount of thought and will continue to sort of occupy people who are trying to figure these kinds of questions out. Because again, can you make societies that give maximum number of people a maximum amount of capacity to express themselves? How do you build these societies? What do they look like? And again, this is not what the question, like the Soviet Union is not asking this question. Fascism is not asking this question because they don't care about individuals. This is why it's a liberal question. It's maybe one of the root, if not the root question of liberalism is to say the value of the individual is great. Therefore, how do we give them maximum freedom to express their capacities? So with that as the idea, one of the things that Hayek notes, and he kind of publishes this in his Road to Serfdom, and he says, hey, when you start planning and centralizing governments, centralizing economies under government control, you sort of become increasingly totalitarian, and that means you increasingly restrict the capacity of individuals to do things that they want to do or may want to do. And so centralized planning and powerful centralized planning is the road to serfdom. And it will inevitably lead to overweening government authority that necessarily crushes the individual. And this is published in just towards the end of the war, 44, 45, 46, 44, I think. But its impact was pretty strong, and it was based on some other work he had done. And so what happens is this generates a lot of activity and a lot of reflection on people. But the general critique of it was like, okay, the critique of the threat of totalitarian governments through centralized planning Great. However, he also articulated that, we should be providing people with basic health care, and no one should go hungry. No one should be homeless. Everybody should be clothed. Of course, any reasonable government will take care of these sorts of human needs. So we want the minimum government capable of producing this general level of good. And I think it's Keynes and several other philosophers pointed out that, hey, you have this concept. We agree we don't want a totalitarian, over-centralized planned government, but you don't really explain, right? What are the trade-offs that are good? When do we know the government has become too centralized? Like all of these core questions. And he took these critiques quite seriously, by the way. So then he comes to the United States, and here's this huge encounter again. So you go from Europe, which has just had this devastating war, but impoverished by the war and by the experiences of the preceding 30 years, under threat of these very large, very centralized governments. And eventually he comes to the University of Chicago, and this is post-war America that we've talked about, where the strong federal government in the United States is brand new. It's only existed for a decade or so by the time he arrives. Still getting sorted out relative to Europe, very light touch. Meanwhile, the economy is booming. There's so much activity. The post-war boom is on. Personal liberty is pretty large if you're not a woman or an African American or a Hispanic immigrant, right? So with all the caveats, the general tenor of it is like, wow, this is amazing. And he goes, right. And so he tries to write new books in which he wants to outline, like, where does this come from? And part of his thinking and teaching is, crucial in laying the foundation of what becomes the Chicago School of Economics and Milton Friedman and all these people who just basically come up with the, free market, absolute limit of government control is the best, et cetera, et cetera. So Hayek is sort of this key figure there, and he lays out the foundation of what we've talked about. Again, limited government, maximum personal choice, so on and so forth. His arc, though, his experience was just what we've talked about earlier, where he goes from this European, more planned, more centralized, more restricted, simply because people had been around, the land had been divvied up, the legal codes had been in place, for centuries, for millennia. It wasn't this, terra incognita, this relatively young country with this massive change undergoing complete transformation because of the war and the post-war world. So Hayek as a founding thinker, no real problem with him there, problem with his different ideas. But the limitations is he did not answer a lot of the core questions, which we'll then see. How this became articulated after him, not necessarily by him, but in following him, he's called this, and in the modern libertarian movement, if you will, is this key question of, along with what we talked about, is self-ownership. This concept of the sovereign individual, that you own yourself. Now, this is, I don't know how you could more efficiently sum up the concept of, if you believe strongly in individual liberty, individualism, and materialism, what is the absolute logical extension of that? Let me tell you, it's the libertarian concept of self-ownership. Oh my gosh, it's just, turn all the dials up to 11 and you'll get this, total being. And by the way, again, strong related to Calvinism, because in Calvinism, it is you and God, and there are no other people, right? Like nobody else matters because it's just you and God. This is what we're talking about. And so this central concept, which theoretically solves these problems, unfortunately, it does not solve any problems. In fact, it creates a whole bunch that are almost too ridiculous to talk about, but we're going to talk about them. But again, if you want to think of the individual, you own yourself, you are property, and you are exchanging your property, which is you, within a free market. This is the core of modern libertarianism. And wow. And so what they're trying to do is say, hey, there's a space between what we can't do and what we must do. This is liberty. And we want to make that as large as possible. And step one is to defend the individual against all claims. And so the most important way to do this is to imagine the individual as property. Now, this is, to me, one of the strangest things because, of course, the history of people as property has not generally been one of liberty. It's been one of slavery, particularly within the American concept, which is one problem is it has this unbelievable it's ahistorical. It does not have that sort of like, oh, obviously the seeing people as property has not really had a great history in the United States and, in fact, many other civilizations for several millennia. Yet there it is. This is one of the core concepts that they keep coming back to as an extension of liberty and ownership and absolute property rights. And this is why when I started, when you look at libertarian stuff like, Cato Institute or something, you'll see individual rights and property rights. These two things are just totally linked. Why? Because they see the individual as property and that you get to own yourself and that this is what freedom looks like. It looks like owning yourself. So, wow, what possible problems could we have with that? Well, one is that, again, is ahistorical in the sense of, African-American experience with this was not so great. But two, it requires you to forget your own history, personal history, and your civic history. And these are two things that libertarianism cannot stand. It cannot stand the past and any obligations to the past. Think back when we were talking about Emerson saying, oh, it would be better, you have no obligations to anybody, past or present or future, right? This is again, this radical extension of this. Because notice, when do you become a free actor who's exchanged in these free market exchanges of equal free actors, right? It's not when you're one, right? We don't take 1-year-olds and put them out on the street and say, okay, kid, knock yourself out. It's not when you're 2 or 4 or 8 or 16, right? Like, when do we say, all right, now you get to make your own decisions and you're your own actor? Usually, it varies, of course, but let's say 18, you can't drink. You can join the military. Interesting distinction. But, when do you? So, okay, maybe when you're 18, you become this free participant in this marketplace of free individuals who are exchanging themselves for whatever. One of the problems here is, well, what about those first 18 years? Something happened. You had parents probably helping to raise you. You had a community helping to raise you, all this stuff. So you're not in a free exchange because you did not choose to be born. So this is not a choice that you made. And in some ways, your parents didn't choose you as an individual. They just said, hey, let's have a baby, or maybe they just had a surprise baby, but they got one. And it's like this kind of lottery effect, right? Ooh, look, we have a baby. We don't know who this baby is. We're going to participate in raising it and creating it and all that, but it's not, parents don't tend to see it as their baby, right? In that sense of, oh, we've predetermined everything about this child. It's like, oh, it's kind of this lottery effect of, oh, we get this individual, can't wait to see what they turn out like. But all that has to be forgotten, because do you have any obligations to these people who you did not freely choose and they didn't freely choose you? So what the hell is going on there? So this is a really difficult and fundamental limitation, because no one knows, no one comes into the world ready to go. And so, if the notion that one day you become your own property, it's like, okay, great, you get a greater degree of freedom, but does that make you no longer responsible for anybody around you? And again, it's not that the family unit can't be one of the most oppressive institutions in the history of man, because it absolutely can be. Does that mean there's nothing there? Like you're now a free individual and you can just forget all that? Maybe. They seem to, basically, as far as I can tell, they don't want to talk about this, what your reciprocal obligations might be to this. Not to mention all the institutions like schools and such that have probably helped you get to where you are. by the time that you turn 18. You also have this in the sense that you've inherited an entire culture. So the one I always like is roads, because roads are so absurdly, absolutely spectacularly expensive. If anybody wants to be shocked and horrified, look at what like a 6-lane freeway costs to both install, to build and lay out, and then to maintain. And the numbers are just, it's hundreds of millions of dollars, and maintenance in particular goes on and on. So it's just absurd. It's almost unbelievable when you think about how many miles and miles and miles of roads most modern countries have, certainly the United States. Okay, you've inherited these by being a citizen. You just arrive. You didn't build them. You haven't even paid for them. You've done nothing, actually, by the time you're, say, 18 and you've become your sovereign individual. You now own yourself. Well, you're in this reciprocal social relationship. What is your obligation relationship? How do all of this work? Right? Like this notion of, everybody should only pay for those things that they want. Because one of the big arguments is like, hey, we shouldn't pay taxes, or we should pay the minimum possible taxes, because that is an imposition, and it's wrong for the government to take money from me to do something that I don't agree with. So let's say I don't want to build roads. So I go, look, I shouldn't have to pay taxes for road building because I don't believe in roads. And that means I'm just not a free exchange. But the government is going, hey, these roads exist. We want to maintain them. Lots of people use them. Maybe you're using them. And this creates what's called in philosophy and economics the free rider problem, right? One of the things libertarianism can be read at as a sort of, not Hayek, by the way, but I mean, as its modern deployment is simply a kind of a philosophical justification for free riderism. Like, all this great stuff exists, but I don't want to pay for it. Why should I have to pay for it? Because I own myself, and you shouldn't be able to impose these taxes on me. And so I don't want to pay for it. And you're like, okay, don't use any of this. Don't drive on roads. Don't use electricity. Don't know. But they don't say that because they do want to use that. And it would be an imposition on their freedom to not use it. Right. And so it is if you once you see this, it's one of those like visual tricks, or once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you realize that what they're really arguing for is this type of sort of backhanded free riderism that allows them to take advantage of this vast cultural wealth of which they are the recipients without feeling the need to in any way participate in it or repay it. You're like, oh my gosh, that is extraordinary, because again, it's back to the individual. Then there's this question of coercion, which they talk about, like the government should not be able to coerce me into doing things I don't want to do, which is a fair question to ask. Again, it's not the fundamental question, how do you construct a society of the maximally free people? It's deployment. And they say, if we get the government out of the way, then that frees up everybody, free market, and then yay, that's great. It's the government that creates all the problems. However, are we really in this equal exchange of individuals? And the example I was thinking of is how many of us have clicked I have read and understand the terms of this agreement without reading or understanding the terms of that agreement? I would think pretty much probably all of us. Why? Because there's just no way if you tried to read all the legal, plus would we understand it? Do we know? No, nobody does. And so what happens is we are individuals, are sovereign individuals. We own ourselves. We're out there in a free exchange, except we're free exchanging with an entity backed by millions and millions of dollars of lawyers and marketer researchers and psychologists who have all created systems to try to trick us. So this is this a free exchange? Now, if the government does this, the libertarians would say, well, no, absolutely not. This is not a free exchange. This is the government tricking you and being evil. But what about all these other entities, most notably corporations, who do this all the time? libertarians say, well, it's free market. But it makes no sense because the individual clearly has no chance. If it's an individual against a corporation, what chance does the individual have? Well, this is not a fair exchange in any way. They're completely outmanned. And so the notion of having a government intervene to protect individuals against exploitation by other large social entities often seems lacking. Now, again, Hayek did not miss this. I mean, he understood this and was willing to talk about this. But in modern libertarianism, this is often or rarely, if ever, discussed. It's just popularly ignored. It's like, oh, the government is the problem. Now, notion is a very interesting question to say, how do you protect the individual against any and all large organized entities who might want to intervene against the individual's liberties? This is, I would say, a better and more not that well articulated, because I just sort of articulated off the top of my head. But if you can frame a question like that, now you're asking what I would say is a much more real and true philosophical question, and an interesting one, because it says, okay, what are all the forms of large social institutions that might impede my liberty? And what are the steps that we can take as a society to alter them? However, what libertarianism has done, and again, hello, Calvinism, it said, no, there's an evil force, that is the government, and there's the good force, self-ownership, my relationship directly with God, or in this case, with myself as God. And therefore, I need to be, the more I'm me, the more good, the more I have to do with the government, the more bad. And so the evil government must be restrained and limited to the maximum degree possible. So this notion of coercion by the government is never generalized, because it is an interesting question. We don't want totalitarian governments to coerce us into doing things we don't want, but where do you draw the line, and what about other forms of large social individuals or social institutions? And then you have their absolute emphasis on property rights. Notice, if you're going to articulate self-ownership, which again is just such a horrible way I hate to even say that. I'm such a humanist. Again, my biases are coming out, so I apologize, but I'm such a humanist that the notion that the greatest thing ever is that I own myself, that I'm a piece of property. I mean, I just find it just kind of offensive, but also kind of hilarious. But that requires some institution that absolutely enforces property rights. And guess what that institution is? It's going to be government. And so government it's just this bizarre never land. It's just paradoxical, because it's like the once very weak, very limited government that has absolute maximum ability to enforce property rights. Right? So that's not a weak or marginal government at all. That's a very strong, centralized, powerful government, because otherwise, how do you enforce property rights? And so that kind of social construction is necessary. And so what's necessary to enforce all these property rights? And it turns out, again, you have to have, large legal system, court systems, prison systems. Basically, you have to have an entire fully functioning large government. It's just that they want a government that's doing one kind of thing rather than doing another kind of thing. And this is very similar to when I talked about when bankers say they don't want regulation. It's just meaningless. It literally has no meaning, because banks exist as regulatory institutions. And so what they're saying is they want the regulations to be written the way they want them, which is the opposite of not wanting regulation. They absolutely want regulation, and they want that regulation to be good for them. This is the same thing. They say, oh, we don't want government. No, we don't want limited government. Nope. No. What they mean is we want a lot of government, but we want it organized exactly the way we want it, which is to say, to protect individual property rights. And because I've actually defined myself as property, this becomes not just but the central function of a government. Now, that a central function of a government should first and foremost be property rights is a claim. It's an argument, I guess. You could decide these kinds of things, but it's certainly not a settled philosophical or socio-political concept. Like, there's lots of arguments about what governments should and shouldn't be doing, but they act as if this is just sort of obvious that that's the only function of a government, is to protect property rights, and that somehow that would be simple, like, oh, just do this one little simple thing. And so what happens by implication of this and the extension is you get all these articles. And again, this is where libertarianism resonates throughout our culture. If this was just some crazy philosophy, which I think it is, that had no resonance, it wouldn't be interesting. I mean, we could kind of critique it and throw rocks at it and go, ha, 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 what a silly thing. But I don't think that would be that productive. What's interesting about libertarianism to me, and why I'm spending all this time on it, is that it conceptualizes all of these concepts. It embodies all these concepts that we have carried with us from our culture. And so you get like lots and lots of popular cultural articles, continuously headlines. You've all seen these, but just as an example, one that I looked up, and you can just do a Google search on this, you'll find a million, is, if you had to pay mothers to do the work they do, this is how much their labor would be worth. There it is, right? The best way to understand a mother, or an important way to understand a mother, is as a contracted worker who is doing labor, because they are property. And when they do something, their property is value. And how we value this in our society is with money. Therefore, as property and as someone who is selling their property, realizing their value, we place a value on that. That value is cash. Therefore, mothers, cleaning room, changing diapers, breastfeeding, cooking meals, babysitting the children, equals they make X, they should be paid or are worth X amount of money, because this is a property exchange. Now, of course, even articulating this just makes me slightly nauseous because, but it shows you how base, how utterly degrading this is of the human experience, is to say that mothers and fathers are in some sort of exchange relationship with their children in which their value as free property could be realized by monetization, and that this is a helpful conceptualization of the relationship between parents and their children. I just find that vexing, let us say. But it does, again, express how we feel about this, right? As a culture, as a society, it's like, oh, and then you go, right. So it's not about love. It's not a love relationship or a sense of obligation or duty or a beautiful opportunity or joy. It's not about joy, right? This can't be a mutually joy-giving sort of commune that we've formed with our little family. No, it can't. That can't be right. We've got these monadic, free-floating individuals who are realizing their property rights and maximizing the benefits for themselves. Then, so again, another extension of this is the impossibility that they think that humans, that they already assume, rather than argue or prove, that individuals are maximally free on their own. And so again, you'll find this, I see this in two other examples, is the tiny house movement, which I've mentioned before. Notice how much of this is focused on individuals who have said, I now have this small space for me. It is mine. Wow, isn't my life great? I've beat the system. Now, I nothing opposed to this, but it's just like, it articulates so clearly. Like, I have this, it's tiny, but it's mine. As opposed to saying, okay, I have something larger that's shared and cooperative and has other problems. Often this is associated with, and I don't own it. It's all paid off. You're like, okay, that's great. So now you're freer because you don't have to pay for a big mortgage or something, but maybe it's worth paying for a big mortgage and then having a bunch of kids around and their friends and the parents of the kid, right? That can be a great thing too, but this doesn't have that social resonance. Like, look, I've built my cabin in the woods. Hello, Thoreau. And I'm in it and it's mine and I'm there by myself. Look at me. I'm the free, established, self-owning property rights individual. Yay. Except for How does that community, communalism? I think fundamentally, I just think it's an emotionally and psychologically damaging way to conceptualize human beings, because it doesn't, I think, build a great sense of personhood. To see this as your final goal. And again, it's not that tiny house people can't live in communities and do all that, but the way it's preached and the way it's pitched is so clearly this libertarian ideal that comes from, again, everything we've been talking about. Another example of this, which people may have heard, is like the 100 things movement. Simplify your life, get rid of all your stuff, only have a few things. I've got 100, I've got 90, I've got 50, I've got 20. And this idea of, we have too much stuff, which is almost certainly we do, which is because we have this sort of crazy material abundance that it generates into, as we've discussed, nihilistic materialism, where we don't even know why we have this shit anymore. And so then people go, right, that's wrong, Calvinism. So we're going to reverse that. Material goods are wrong. They weigh you down. Hello, the Buddha. We're just going to eliminate everything. Another question you could ask, but this would not be in the American tradition, is, okay, I'm going to have stuff, but what if it's not for me? What if I have stuff for other people? What if I make things and opportunities so that other people can use them, participate with them, build a bigger community, have a space? So it used to be like this was just a necessity, but towns, little villages and cities used to have one bakery, and everybody the bakery wouldn't necessarily make the bread. They could make their own bread and take it to be baked or to be cooked at a central location. So not everybody had an oven, but everybody had access to an oven. So you could say, I have something good. I want to buy things to help my community that other people can use, that it's not all for me. But if you look at the 100 Things movement, or whatever it is they call it, and the simplification movements, it's almost invariably, not quite invariably, almost invariably talked about as your personal relationship to your things. You own things like yourself, and therefore you dispose of them based on you for yourself. So this was what was the Japanese lady, little sparks of joy person? And again, in a world filled with clutter and too much crap, nihilistic materialism, I get it. Kondo, that was it, Marie Kondo. I get it. However, it again is articulated as, I think her phrase was, does it give you sparks of joy? If it doesn't, you should get rid of it. You could also ask, does it give you sparks of joy? Will it give other people sparks of joy who you interact with? If a friend comes over, I had a friend who actually kept his favorite mustard in our refrigerator because he didn't like the mustard we bought. He liked this other mustard, and we weren't that big of fans of his mustard, so we kept our mustard, and he kept his mustard in our refrigerator because he was over eating at a fair clip, which is great. Does it give me sparks of joy? In a way, it really did, because I was never going to use that mustard, but I could see that somebody else was, somebody I liked, somebody I wanted to have in my life. And so, but this continually asking the question about you. Now, it is still a question about you. Notice, you're saying, oh yes, this gives me a spark of joy because it is for somebody else. And thinking of that person being happy or enjoying it or being around makes me happy. But that's rarely how these are conceptualized or presented. It's usually just, oh, this is my shirt. Do I like it? Do I not like it? Okay, if I don't like it, I'm going to get rid of it. And so this, again, attempt to just make people isolated and singular. You'll see this. There's actually a YouTube channel called Adam Something. That's actually what it's called, Adam Something. And I think he's a Hungarian. Maybe not Hungarian, but I do think he's a Hungarian city planner. And so this Western U.S. libertarian nonsense drives him mad, because all the tech innovation stuff that you see coming is almost invariably robo-taxis, right? Individual cars that are self-driving cars, right? So but why have self-driving cars? They solve almost no problems. What really would be great is a bunch of self-driving buses. But you could also just have buses driven by people, because we know how buses work. So get the cars off the road and just put 100 times as many buses off. And then you would be able to move freely. You wouldn't have to worry about having a car, all the advantages of this. But we hate this idea, particularly in the United States, because we don't trust public transportation, because it's not an individual freedom. In this case, it's not my car. I'm not disposing of it my way. So again, they always imagine like everything seems to come in pods because it's individual pods, a little living pod. Oh, this is a living pod someone can be in. Oh, but why do you have to live in a pod? Can't you just live in a nice apartment block? Couldn't we have a nice community of shared space? No. Everyone's got to have their own pod, because it is, again, the monadic individual who owns their pod, who is standing in Thoreau's cabin, except for, of course, they'll have high-speed internet and satellite relay stuff now, that will make life great. And so you just see this the absolute consistency. One example he uses, which is sort of controversial on the West Coast, because I think it's University of San Diego wanted to build new dorms. And I think Munger, the crazy billionaire, decided he was going to design the dorm, which, of course, and he just, this dystopic Neverland. But the argument he made is, we're going to make, I'm not making this up, rooms without light from the outs, no natural light, no natural air. But each room would be one person. You would have your own room. And this would make people happier, because it's better to be in a lightless, airless, I'm not making that up, no windows, no natural air, but you would have your own space. And so it's like, and that anybody could even come up with this, much less University of San Diego think they were going to build it, just shows you how far this just seems like such a natural extension to us. And so why I think libertarianism is super important is not as a philosophy, because it just doesn't answer any of the questions it raises, but because it articulates so clearly the biases and cultural forms that are just innate in American life. And if you want to understand American life, take a look at libertarian concepts and just realize that they're just articulating the irrational collection of nonsense that we believe, but they're articulating it clearly. Finally, a way to think against libertarianism is to realize that it has a very, very limited concept even of what they mean by freedom, by liberty. So it's almost invariably materialistically based, right? It is, again, property ownership being the centrality of all this. But think of something like freedom from fear. Now, not being afraid is a very, very great liberty, right? If you're afraid all the time, this is a huge imposition on your capacity to feel free, to basically do anything. Fear is a great killer of joy, of the capacity to think of all kinds of things. But property rights they don't really just help you that much. Even if you have a strong sense that you own yourself, well, what if you feel threatened by some other self-owning property person? And this has become articulated in parts of the United States. This is why gun culture is so huge with us, is because I have mine and I'm going to protect it. I'm kind of my own military. But notice this doesn't make you free from fear. It makes you mutually assured destruction, right? So it makes you the opportunity to threaten. And so because you're threatening, the other people probably won't attack you. And so, but I'm going to carry this gun around all the time. So when you see a culture in which lots of people are feeling like they need to carry guns all the time, this doesn't say you're free, even though it's like, oh, the freedom to bear arms. Okay, big argument in the United States, of course. But it doesn't free you from fear, which is theoretically one of the things you would like to do. Or you think about something like capacity, right? Oh, the freedom to read, right? If you can't read, that's a very great limitation. But how are you going to get an education? How are you going to learn to read? Usually this is done through, education. But if we don't have social institutions for education, which has existed in the past, it's pretty clear that people don't learn to read. And so then this is a big limitation. And you go, oh, okay, well, this is your personal responsibility to learn to read apparently after you're 18. because when you get to take over these kinds of things. But that sort of freedom they rarely talk about. Or something like the freedom of movement. I'll give a slight defense of the Cato Institute, very slight, but they recognize that if individuals aren't free to move wherever they want, then you really can't have a libertarian society. So they think free immigration has to exist. So generally they're viewed as very conservative. They are fairly conservative. However, in this case, they're like, look, but you just have to have totally free immigration, because if you're not free to immigrate, then you basically don't have choices. But this whole notion of freedom of movement, like if I can't get from point A to point B, then that's a great limitation on my freedom. Great. So how can I do that? And this is back to why roads exist, right? Well, roads exist because people like to move themselves and stuff around. Is this a good way? Should I participate in that? You can refuse to participate in it, but then you're going to lose your freedom of movement. And so one of the things to really try and get within your mind is to think about all the possible kinds of freedoms, flavors of freedom, that libertarianism just simply does not address, which is basically all of them. How many freedoms are not property associated, that cannot be reduced to kind of property ownership kinds of issues? And again, it just like freedom from fear. It would be great to be free of fear, but this is not necessarily constructed through a bunch of monadic individuals carrying around guns. Although this is an attempt to running the United States. That's how mad we've gone down this road. So when you ponder the United States, one thing to really think about, and again, this is the kind of one of the culminations of why I'd wanted to talk so much about Calvinism and materialism and individuality, is because it has expressed itself in this very clearly articulated libertarian quote-unquote philosophy that is influential and that people sort of believe in and respond to organically, not without thinking about it, because it all just sounds so good. Of course I want to own myself. That seems like a good thing. But is that the way you want to think about it? And it doesn't ask, what are the things that might liberate me as an individual that can only be done communally, that can't be done individually and can't be done with these sorts of associations? And so when you start asking those questions, you realize not just that libertarianism has this very big sort of massive hole in the middle of it, but the entire U.S. cultural outlook struggles from this, because we tend not to think that way. And so it blinds us to all kinds of problems that we're trying to address with varying degrees of success that every society faces. And so libertarianism becomes just this spectacular spokesperson for the problems that we face, because it articulates them so clearly. So American libertarianism, again, I think it really does capture the essence of a lot of the elements that we've talked about, and why many Europeans in particular, but other countries, just struggle to understand what the hell is going on in the United States. Thank you very much. And oh yes, don't forget, class coming up soon. So if you're interested, check out my website and sign up soon. Thank you.